Welcome all. Welcome all to our event today. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone see me fine? Can everyone see the slides? If anyone's having any trouble, please let us know through the chat. So welcome all, and we would like first to start with a land acknowledgement. So while we meet here on a virtual platform, we would like to take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people. We invite you to learn more about the territory on which you reside on native-land.ca. So after our presentation, today we will have the presentation will last 30 minutes and we will have around 25 minutes for the Q&A. You should be able to see the Zoom generated closed captions in your screen as live transcript as a means of accessibility. And please save your questions during the presentation. You will be able to enter your question during the Q&A after the presentation. And please note that your name and your question will be visible to all attendees. You can also upvote another person's question to the top of the list if you wish. So my name is Natalia Otto. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Toronto and an incoming assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. And I'm here today representing the Violence in Society Research Cluster of the Canadian Sociological Association. And if you'd like to learn more about our work, please reach out to me after this event. And finally, it is my honor to introduce you to Professor Walter DeKeseredy. He is Anna Dean Carlson Endowed Chair of Social Sciences, the Director of Research Center on Violence, and Professor of Sociology at West Virginia University. Walter has been widely recognized for his extensive scholarly contributions to the field of violence against women. He has published close to 30 books, 140 articles, and 120 book chapters on violence against women and other social problems. And I only have time to name the latest of his many distinctions. In 2022, he was named an American Society of Criminology Fellow, received the Praxis Award from the Division of Critical Criminology and Social Justice, and received the 2022 Robert Jarin Book Award from the Division of Victimology for his book, Women Abused in Rural Places. Today, Walter will discuss his latest book, Skating on Thin Ice, Professional Hockey, Rape Culture, and Violence Against Women, co-authored with Dr. Martin Schwartz, who is an emeritus professor of sociology and anthropology at Ohio University, and Stu Cowan, who is a sports columnist with the Montreal Gazette, with over 35 years of experience in the sports department. Please join me in welcoming Professor DeKeseredy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Natalie, for hosting this, and special thanks to Sherry Fox for inviting me to make this presentation on our new book. And I must state at the outset that I am a Canadian citizen, and it's really exciting to reconnect with the Canadian Sociological Association. And I look forward to the annual conference in Montreal and reuniting with some really wonderful people who've had a major influence on my thinking over the last 41 years. I want to talk, about how this book was born. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about the content because I'd like the participants to ask questions and make some comments. Now, it's interesting. For years, I wanted to write about violence against women in sport and never got around to it. I kept saying, I've got to do something about this. And the book was basically conceived on the early morning of July 24th in 2021. And I'm a great Montreal Canadiens hockey fan. I lived for a number of years as a young boy in Montreal, and you really get influenced by the excitement about the team, and it's a very storied franchise. But on July 24th, 2021, that was the day my allegiance to the Montreal Canadiens temporarily died, because I learned through reading a story written by Montreal Gazette journalist and friend now, Stu Cowan. He wrote that, this esteemed franchise unexpectedly selected a convicted sex offender in the first round of the NHL draft on Friday, July 23rd. And this deeply disturbing action just rocked the hockey world, and it continues to be the subject of much discussion and debate. And the player's name, you may have heard of him, if those of you who are hockey fans. He plays for the Laval Rocket right now in the Montreal Canadiens Farm Club. His name is Logan Mailloux, and while playing in Sweden in 2020, Mailloux, as described in greater detail in Chapter 1 in Skating on Thin Ice, he secretly photographed an 18-year-old woman he had consensual sex with. He was on loan, by the way, from the London Knights to a Swedish team during the COVID pandemic. And so he secretly photographed consensual sexual relations with an 18-year-old woman, and then shared the picture and her identity with his Swedish teammates. And after reading Stu Cowan's story, I asked myself, how could this happen? How could such a classy team stoop to this level? And for people who don't know, the Montreal Canadiens have won 24 Stanley Cups, and their rosters over the years have included some of the world's greatest players, including Jacques Plante, Maurice Rocket Richard, who you'll see is pictured on the left in the screen, Guy Lafleur, Frank Mahovlich, and of course, one of the most important gentlemen in the field, Jean Beliveau, who's on the right. I was deeply concerned, not only because I'm a fan, but because I have spent nearly 40 years of my life studying various types of face-to-face and online types of violence against women, as well as being involved in progressive struggles to end these harms. I don't know if any of you remember, but I conducted in 1992 the Canadian National Survey of Women Abuse in University and College Dating. And that was one of my biggest contributions to the field in Canada. But I felt I had to do something right away. And at that time, I was working on what is called image-based sexual abuse. Many people refer to it as revenge porn, which is highly problematic. It's not just about revenge. There are other motives for it. Granted, a healthy portion of men who do post non-consensually, pictures and videos of women they had sex with, they are estranged from partners who have initiated departures from them. But I felt I had to do something right away. I wasn't sure, but I thought I'd email Stu Cowan on July 25th, in 2021. And I wasn't sure whether he would get back to me, because many journalists are very, very busy, as you know. So I was rather surprised, but very pleased. And he got back to me the next day and interviewed me for 2 columns that appeared in the Montreal Gazette on July 27th in 2021. And around the same time, my close friend and colleague and co-author of this book, Martin Schwartz, published a very important article on patriarchal masculinity, sport, and violence against women in the widely read and cited journal Violence Against Women. So the wheels started spinning in my brain. And in this piece, which I urge you to read, Martin pointed out that there was a burst of creative investigation into the relationship between sports and woman abuse in the 1980s and 1990s. But unfortunately, this connection was ignored in recent years. And he also declared it's time to go back and take up this topic again. And this is one of the key reasons why we decided to team up and write this book, which is written for the general public. I think it is a prime example of public sociology and public criminology. We want this book to reach a large audience and help influence major changes in amateur and professional hockey. And based on what I'm hearing from my editor at University of Toronto Press, it is reaching a large audience, and I'm glad to hear that. So starting with Chapter 1 and drawing on decades of rigorous sociological research and Stu Cowan's rich experience as a sports journalist specializing in hockey-related issues, Skating on Thin Ice supplies salient examples of abusive, misogynistic, racist, and homophobic behaviors in the world of professional hockey. And it examines the larger societal forces that perpetuate and legitimate the harms covered in each chapter. Before I talk about the voices of women, I want to say that hockey has kind of flown under the radar. And here in the United States, where I'm based, many people say, well, you know, it's a Canadian game. Well, sure, it is, you know, Canada's national sport, but it's actually the British who invented it. And also, if we go back to the original 6 hockey teams, only 2 were Canadian, Montreal and Toronto, and the vast majority of the farm clubs were American, and they still are today. And if you look at the 32 teams that currently exist in the NHL, only 6 are Canadians. So this is very, very interesting. This sport is very much rooted in the American landscape. But getting back to chapter 2, we give much attention to the voices of survivors because effective means of preventing what happened to them has to be rooted in respect for their experiential knowledge. And I find compared to the survivors of violence committed by NFL football players and college football players and pro basketball players and college basketball players, the experiences and the voices of women who have endured violence both offline and online in the world of hockey have been, you know, ignored. Although things are changing now, especially with the attention given to the 2018 gang rape in London, Ontario. And we can talk a bit more about that. Why do professional hockey players abuse women? Well, based on years of research, hands-on research, both qualitative and quantitative, done by me and Martin Schwartz and our colleagues, we answer this question in chapter 3 by introducing a new male peer support theory. Now, male peer support is a concept I developed in the late 80s while I was a PhD student at York University in sociology, and it refers to the attachments to male peers and the resources that these men provide, which encourage and legitimate various types of woman abuse. And the male peer support theory that's provided in chapter 3, it's also been published in the Sociology of Sport journal. It deals with the many influences, including having sexist and abusive peers that convince men that they're entitled to the privileges of patriarchy, and that on some occasions it's acceptable to use force to make women behave accordingly. Our theory, though, does not put all the blame on professional hockey. And I think this is a key point that's made in the book, especially in light of the Hockey Canada scandals and atrocities. We show that young men like Logan Mailloux enter the world of professional hockey already trained and primed to treat women as objects and often to commit violent acts against them. In fact, I'm convinced now that junior hockey in Canada is perhaps worse than college and football and basketball and other types of combative sports in the United States. Hockey has, again, flown on the radar, due in large part because most of the players are white, and especially in the United States, when people think about crime, they think about Black people. There's a lot of racism that enters into people's perceptions about crime. Hockey also, as you know, is heteronormative. It's not that there aren't gay men who play. I'm sure there are quite a few, but because of hegemonic masculinity and heteronormativity, there's only one person who has actually publicly identified as being gay, and he plays for the Nashville Predators Farm Club. It's not only male peer support that contributes to professional hockey players' abuse of women and senior team officials' tolerance of their hurtful behavior. We have to emphasize that because the owners, the managers, and the coaches contribute to this problem. They tolerate it as well as fans. And so in chapter 4, we center on the broader social forces that uphold toxic hockey culture. Hockey culture doesn't operate in a vacuum, as most sociologists know. So we devote a lot of attention to patriarchal structures in society that affect the socialization patterns of men and the way they learn to do masculinity. So it's, connecting macro level forces with interpersonal dynamics. We talk about the objectification of women, how hockey players are taught to objectify women, as are other men, the holding of rape myths. And my God, when, Stu was reporting about Logan Mailloux, you should have seen the letters below his columns, the letters attacking him and defending Logan Mailloux. And, many of these comments included rape myths. And also, we can't ignore the lessons learned from today's violent and racist pornography. And let's not forget that Pornhub, one of the biggest producers of online pornography, is based in Canada. It's based in Montreal. What is to be done about toxic hockey culture? Heavily informed by feminist ways of knowing and the left realist school of critical criminology, Chapter 5 provides progressive answers to this question, but it doesn't simply repeat what others have already called for. Heavily informed by our male peer support theory, we devote a substantial amount of attention to outlining the role progressive men can play to prevent the pain and suffering that we've identified. Our wish is that this book makes a difference. It's not enough to simply look at what we know about an issue or experience. We must ask how this knowledge helps define and change individual experience, how this knowledge reflects or changes power dynamics, institutions like professional hockey, and relationships in our society. Obviously, the three of us do not have all the possible solutions, but regardless of which approach you actually think is best, as critical thinkers with a passion for hockey, what we do know for sure is what ultra-realists Simon Winlow, Steve Hall, and James Treadwell, and Daniel Briggs, who are based in the UK, state in their 2015 book, Riots and Political Protest: Things Can't Go On As They Are. And hopefully the world of professional hockey and junior hockey will be a much better place when you finish reading this book. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Walter, for this presentation and for this crucial contribution to the field of violence against women. So do we have some questions? The Q&A session should be open now. I can start us off with a couple of questions. So one, something that I was really struck by reading the book, Walter, is how male peer support theory was able to explain social interactions both at the micro level in hockey culture, but at the same time being a theory that I feel could be widely applied, right, to a multitude of organizations and institutions.
Well, first of all, as Lee Bowker, who had a big influence on me, he's retired now. He wrote this, he was a feminist criminologist, and he wrote this book, Beating Wife Beating, in which he correctly stated that these patriarchal subcultures of violence that are involved in woman abuse, they exist in every social group, every religion, every race, ethnicity, and so on. So male peer support is ubiquitous. And when you take a look at the growing body of international research that has been accumulated over the past 35 years, including work done in South Africa, the United States, Canada, Latin America right now, some of your colleagues in Brazil are heavily influenced by male peer support theory. You'll see that male peer support is one of the most powerful determinants. Now, when it comes to hockey, it makes perfect sense. Hockey teams are like total, what Goffman would refer to as total institutions. Plus, these men, there's a study that was done by David Levinson. He wrote this book, Family Violence in Cross-Cultural Perspective, and used the human area relations files, which I don't know if anthropologists still do, But he found that in societies where men band very closely together and reside apart from women, you have the very high rates of violence against women. And this is exactly what's happening in the world of hockey. They eat together, travel together, they're on the buses together. Their wives and girlfriends are not allowed to travel with them to away games and so on. So, this sense of bonding and the attachments to male peers. But what I found is you start off with the research, and there is a growing body of empirical work which actually doesn't exist in sociology and criminology journals, but it's found in kinesiology journals and phys ed journals. For example, one of your colleagues at the University of Toronto, Gretchen Kerr, who's the dean of kinesiology, she's had a great influence on my work, and she has a new book out on gender-based violence against children in sport. And so when you start looking outside of, these silos, you'll see that there's a lot of this going on. And if it was only 2% or 3% of men doing this, then I'd say, okay, that's rely on primarily psychological perspectives. But these interpersonal dynamics are fundamentally important, and they exist within a society that's characterized by, gender inequality, and hockey very much is. Although I see that Genevieve Paquette is in the room, and perhaps she wants to speak, and we write about her and some other leaders in the Montreal Canadiens in chapter 2 in the book, including Chantal Maccabee and Miss Belanger, and how they're taking very important steps to diversify and make the hockey management more inclusive. So maybe Genevieve would like to speak.
Oops, sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Walter. Yeah, so I don't know if Genevieve would like to speak. Oh, there they are. Well, while maybe we decide or they prepare, we have a question
Okay.
here by Lily. So Lily says, thank you so much for a great talk, Walter. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on intergenerational violence and / patriarchal beliefs in families, and how those interact with or mitigate influences of peer communities.
This is a very good question, and I return to Lee Bowker. Now, intergenerational transmission, many people have found over the years, it was very much a common sense explanation, particularly in the 80s. But many people have found that many men grow up watching their fathers beat their mothers, but yet become very kind, decent people, because many mothers engage in resistance and talk to their sons, and we forget that many children have very good empathy skills and are very intelligent. But having said that, we talk about in this book, we do connect intergenerational transmission with male peer support, and influenced by Bowker. What Bowker found, and we're finding this too, that men raised in these households in which the father is very patriarchal and adheres to norms in which he is the king of the castle and he's in charge of his partner and the children. If these boys who are exposed to what are called, Bowker calls these things standards of gratification, if these boys interact with other boys who have been exposed to this, it's very likely that patriarchal male peer group dynamics will emerge. So there is a connection between intergenerational transmission and male peer support. There is. But intergenerational transmission alone, no. The research shows that it's not as strong a determinant as people thought it was in the 80s.
Thank you. We have another question from Linda. So Linda remarks here that gang rape is a form of torture. And she asks whether you have considered that the hockey players are actually torturing women when they engage in gang rapes off the ice, in this off-ice conduct rituals. And she also mentions that this is why women have such a hard time coming forward to report such gang rapes, because torture is very destructive to a woman's sense of self.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it is a form of torture and it's a degradation ceremony and it's a form of punishment. For example, when I was living in rural Southeast Ohio, I did a study, rich in-depth interviews with 43 women who wanted to leave or trying to leave in the process of leaving or who have left their partners. As you know, separation constitutes a six-fold increase in a woman's risk of being killed. And a healthy portion of the women we interviewed talked about how when their partners, thought they were leaving or when they were trying to leave, they would bring their friends over to gang rape them, to punish them, to torture them. And it's really, Linda's point is actually, right on. But also it's a form of what we found in hockey, especially in junior hockey. It's an initiation ritual. It's also very much a bonding ritual. Now, the act itself is torture. The outcome is torture. But many of these, what we're starting to believe, Stu Cowan, Marty, and me, that what we saw in London, Ontario, and of course, they're talking about 2003 in Halifax with the World Juniors, this may have been an ongoing tradition, as it is in fraternities. Here in the United States, where you have a healthy portion of fraternities, and by the way, at my university, we have a female sexual assault victimization rate of 34%. It's one of the highest in the country. And the women who are at the highest risk of being sexually assaulted are sorority women who spend a lot of time with high-risk men, the fraternity boys.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Linda, for your question and comment. Now we have Kim Dubé, who introduces themselves, saying thank you for the presentation. I don't know where to start. I've dedicated my PhD thesis to the representation in Canadian media of sexual violence committed by male athletes, and I am now a professor of criminology at the University of Moncton, and continue to work on the subject of sexual violence in sports, particularly at the post-secondary level. I've done a couple of media interviews on the subject of Logan Melu and the Hockey Canada. I'm just so grateful for what you do. Thank you. And then they ask, as feminist criminologists, how can we continue to work on the subject and make a difference? And I must add, while staying safe ourselves, given the current political climate.
Well, I think one of the most important things is social support, and I'm glad to hear you're doing this research. And please, let's communicate. Let's exchange notes and ideas. I'm really trying to get people together who have common interests and concerns in this field. As I mentioned earlier, there was a burst of activity in the late 80s up to the late 90s, and it just disappeared. And when I look at, the criminology of sport literature, and I teach a course on criminology of sport, and I'm using some, critical criminology of sport books that come out of England. England seems to be focusing on this. And of course, there's a new Canadian book, Power Played, that Silva and Kennedy at Western Ontario have come out with. Yet they ignore athletes' violence, which is very interesting in this book. And they say, if you want to read about athletes' violence, close this book now, which I found kind of odd. But nevertheless, I think it's really important, especially in Canada, to go out and gather more data. We need more data. We absolutely need more data. Then we need to engage in more types of public sociology and criminology. There's been too much, what worries me in terms of media representations. If you read the Gazette, and I do religiously every morning, and I read the Toronto Star every morning, I subscribe to both. When you look at the hostility, the vitriol directed at Stu Cowan, Jack Todd, and other progressive male reporters with the Gazette who are identifying these atrocities, and Stu and Jack Todd have done a fantastic job. I mean, they're not one of these journalists they're not journalists who are apologists. They're very much taking an active role in identifying these atrocities. I think it's really important that we have an alternative voice out there and that more of us take our research and engage in newsmaking criminology, also known as public criminology. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think we need, I'm having a panel, by the way, please come. It's in Montreal at the Canadian Sociological Association conference on violence against women in sport.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Kim. On that note, Walter, I was thinking, I'll ask you another question while our attendees formulate their questions. Because you mentioned that on the one side, there was this early research on violence against women in sport in the 80s, and then there was this decrease or almost silence about the topic towards more contemporary research, which strikes me as odd, as sport seems to be growing and growing in attention in the media, in importance in our culture. And interestingly, which you touched towards the end of the movie, as well as in capital, I mean, in financial power.
Yeah.
So what is the role really of capital, let's say, or the financial aspect of professional sports, or maybe hockey specifically, that might challenge, make it difficult to have these conversations and also to protect victims and survivors?
Yeah, capitalism plays a key role, and we talk a lot about it in our book. You know, let's face it, it's money. Same with college. Here in the United States, when you talk about university and college athletes, that's big money, and they get paid now. Some of them are being paid millions of dollars. They have this thing called name, image, and likeness, and it worries me because athletes were always violent here. But now, with all this money thrown at them, you know, there may be more protection of their behavior. And one of the things we talk about in the book related to your concern about capitalism, what we see with many managers of all kinds of male teams, they try to say, well, what happens on the field is distinct from what happens off the field. And there's this narrative of the second chance. You know, look at Vander Kane and these other people. And if you look at the NHL, it's the only professional sport in North America that doesn't have a domestic violence policy nor a sexual violence policy. It's Gary Bettman, the commissioner, who makes the decision. And then the NHL Players Association jumps in with an arbitrator and says we talk about a hockey player Bettman wanted to suspend him for 26 games, and it was reduced to 13. So money is very much there. It is. It's a driving force, very much a driving force. Now, the other thing I want to say, though, is investigative journalists are playing the most important role in identifying this, which is really interesting because when you talk about the absence of research, our book is filled with stories that were produced by investigative journalists. And I really admire their courage because they're jeopardizing their access to, you know, general managers, coaches, and players. For example, after the Logan Mailloux stories that Stu wrote, Jeff Molson, CEO of Montreal, didn't let him come to a press conference about Logan Mailloux, which is interesting. But money is very much a determining factor. It's not just, and here's the other thing related to your point, Natalia, same with corporate crime, any type of corporate crime. And we talk about, you know, corporate violence against women in sport. I'm not convinced. Lorraine Snyder at Queen's University used this expression, and she was one of the world's leading experts on corporate crime. She said, given that profit drives it, I'm not convinced that replacing penises with vaginas is going to eliminate this. So we have to also create some type of social responsibility and also look at intersectionality because it's class, gender, and race. And let's not forget that hockey is a very expensive sport. When I grew up, it was a working class sport. You know how much a stick costs now? It's one of the most bourgeois sports you can imagine. And this is why now 1 out of every 3 NHL players comes from the NCAA in the United States. And they can get paid. And the Quebec and Maritime Major Junior League, the Western Hockey League, and the Ontario Hockey League are going to somewhat suffer because the top Canadian talent are going to go to these schools that are going to pay them big money, especially in the Big Ten Conference. So money's going to, this worries me about what the changes that have happened in the US college system, because players are going to make money. And some of them can make more than they can playing pro.
Yes, absolutely. And speaking of that, speaking of the challenges, but also what do you see as the possibilities for the future for both research and activism in fighting violence against women in sport? You touched that towards the end of the book, right? What are the, and let's say from both a top-up perspective, so from a structural perspective, but also for a more micro, everyday perspective, starting with the socialization of younger boys in amateur teams. How do you see this future and the possibilities?
Well, I look to Canada and I look to Australia. I'm seeing some very good changes happening. Yet, first of all, we're seeing a Me Too movement, especially with, Hockey Canada. And, those 5 players who have been charged, I'm sure they're absolutely terrified right now. And I think people who are other players are deeply worried. People are coming forward. So I think we're starting to see a Me Too movement. Even the Canadian federal government, launched some investigations. This is happening. So that's really positive. We are seeing Canadians talking. Also, if you read USA Today, which I do, it's changed completely. Every week, there are 2 female journalists that identify cases of, crime and deviance within sport, especially atrocities committed by men. So it's starting to get much more public attention. I am, though, very disappointed with Hockey Canada, which talks on CBC, which pays next to no attention to the atrocities that are going. But the Star, the Gazette, and others, there's some really good stuff. There are some politicians who are actually involved. There are community associations that are involved. We even see corporate responsibility after the Hockey Canada scandal broke and the World Juniors were in Edmonton. Did you notice that the boards were blank? Tim Hortons didn't sponsor, Esso didn't sponsor. So even corporations that profit about this. The other thing that's interesting with TSN, which is very popular in Canada, Rick Westhead is a journalist with TSN. And if you go to his X, formerly Twitter, every day he talks about atrocities in sport, sexual assault, hazing, and so on. This is a very courageous man because TSN makes much of its money from broadcasting the World Juniors. So we are seeing this movement that's happening. It's happening. And I think Canadians were so outraged that their tax dollars, because don't forget, Hockey Canada gets 6% of its money from your taxes and other Canadians' taxes, as well as money from parents who have to register their children. And they're outraged about this, So that we are seeing movement. What I would like, we are seeing grassroots movement. We are seeing some political movement. We're seeing some journalistic movement. What we need, and Linda was talking about this, we need more research. We need more researchers getting out there and collecting the data, doing rich, in-depth interviews. We need surveys that document the extent and distribution of this problem in Canada. And we need more connections between academics and local community groups, because in these small towns like Kirkland Lake and all these things, these junior hockey players, these young boys are elevated to a level of stardom. They get free drinks in bars, they're billeted in households, and some of the families protect them. I mean, there were sexual assaults committed in the homes in which these boys were billeted. And don't forget, these families get paid for this. So they have a vested interest not to see these people, prosecuted. But there is some positive movement. There really is. All is not gloom and doom. Oh, one other thing I need to say, there is a shift also in management. I would like to see it taken one step further. And, the Montreal Canadiens have hired some very highly talented people in management positions, the Toronto Maple Leafs as well. We're seeing assistant general managers, and other teams in the NHL. I would like to see female presidents. I'd like to see more members of the LGBTQ community in leadership positions. I would like to see more people of color. So far, there's only one man of color who's a general manager in the NHL. So intersectionality needs to be addressed.
Absolutely, thank you. And it's good to hear that that you see some positive changes coming up. So André introduced himself and has a question. So my name is André Silva. I am Brazilian. I'm a Brazilian researcher specializing in the field of gender and violence in sports. Hi, André. I'm also Brazilian. First, I would like to express my gratitude for the insightful presentation. And in one of the studies I have been conducting, I have observed that male peer support also appears to resonate with some women who endorse the argument put forth by these groups of men and functions as advocates for male privileges. I'm curious to hear your perspective on this dynamic and how you perceive the relationship between male peer support and women's endorsement of male privileges.
Well, this is Andre. Hi. By the way, Andre Silva is visiting us here at West Virginia University from Brazil, and we're really happy to have him here. Yes, let's not forget, Mary Daly, who wrote a very important radical feminist book, Gynecology. I don't know if people remember it. It's very, very important. She talked about some women as token torturers and exonerators. And we do provide some examples of this. Take Andre, for example, I was just writing today, I'm finishing up another book for University of Toronto Press, how in Glen Ridge, New Jersey, March 1st, 1989, a woman with mental disabilities was brutally raped by 13 male athletes at Glen Ridge High School, which, by the way, Tom Cruise went there, the actor Tom Cruise. They lured this girl, 17-year-old girl, into the basement of two of the athletes, and 5 of them raped her, including using a broom handle and a baseball bat. And what happened, the whole community defended these boys. They were all American athletes, and women attacked the survivor. They said, "What are you doing to these boys? You're destroying these boys." Well, what about the victim? And we saw some examples of this too in Steubenville, Ohio, where, that there was a gang rape in 2012, and those boys posted this on social media. There's a documentary on Netflix titled Roll, Red, Roll, which is about this. So there are, women who do act in the terms of what Mary Daly's talking about, exonerators, or token torturers. I mean, it's not just, men who are up, holding up the patriarchy.
Yes, thank you. Margarita also has a question. So sports people, oh, there it is. Sports people are role models for teenagers and young adults who want to pursue a sports career. How do you work on prevention plans to prevent future sports kids from perceiving those violent behaviors as normal and as examples?
Well, I think there has to be, more public discussion. I think there is. More and more is coming out, right? More stories are coming out, and especially, in journalism, not so much in research, but in journalism. And I think, we've got to have mandatory trainings. Now, in Quebec, they're coming up with, I think, licenses for coaches. They're going to do background checks on coaches. There has to be mandatory, in my opinion, my policy recommendations, and I'm not alone. There are others who agree with me within the sociology of sport. There has to be mandatory training for leaders, adults as well, to get them to understand the nature of violence against women. You can't just educate these boys. A lot of these coaches have been raised in a patriarchal society and see these things as normal and as a function of male bonding. So we need a holistic approach. These sports organizations like Hockey Canada, Soccer Canada, and we know what happened with the women's soccer team, and as well as the US women's soccer team, the inequities and, the different payments and so on. There has to be, a multi-pronged approach, education, awareness, prevention programs, not just at the start of the season, but throughout. Sheldon Kennedy has a model, it's called his respect and consent plan. I don't know if folks know it, but he was, sexually abused 357 times by his junior hockey coach, which is pretty terrifying. And let's not forget, there are a lot of men in hockey who are sexually abused by their coaches, and in other sports too. So we have to, have mandatory training and education, mandatory within all sports. Coaches require licenses. We need to do background checks. There needs to be audits of sexual assault and other forms of violence against women prevention, and more accountability within the criminal justice system too. I'm not saying the criminal justice system will solve things, but my God, in London, Ontario, how did it take 6 years to charge these players? 6 years. This happened in 2018. Something's wrong there. We need a multi-pronged approach, one that targets, broader cultural change as well as the institutions themselves, sporting institutions. And I think we need to change the nature of sport. We need to emphasize more play and recreation rather than hyper-masculine competitiveness. And this is what dominates, by the way, in the United States. And I'm starting to hear that, and my Canadian colleagues could talk about this, that some Canadian schools are starting to offer scholarships, which on the one hand, you could say that's good for people who are economically disenfranchised. But on the other hand, once you start investing money into this and move it away from, playing just, for recreation and fun, then the school has an economic vested interest in this and may protect these players. I don't know if I sounded too long-winded there, but there's no simple solution.
Yes, and thank you, Walter. Thank you, Margarita, for the question. And on that note, returning to the question of sexual violence against also men and boys, I was really struck in the book how well the book explains the connection actually between homophobia and misogyny, and how clear this connection is made in the stories where actually women are not the only victims of violence. They're really harrowing descriptions of sexual violence against boys, sexual violence in the context of hazing. So could you expand a little bit on the role actually of homophobia in the story?
It's an integral part of hockey. Now, it's an integral part of many elements of society, but I would argue it's even more pronounced in hockey than it. One professional player who's publicly identified as gay. And then homophobia is a very powerful form of social control of men in general. It was of me when I was a boy. How many times, I'd hear in the locker room, "What's wrong with you? Are you a fag or something?" That was, part and parcel of playing sports, part and parcel of playground activity when I grew up. And it's obviously still here. But homophobia is a very powerful mechanism of patriarchal support, and that is part of the bonding. For example, if we go back and look at Raywin Connell's work on hegemonic masculinity, the principles of hegemonic masculinity, which are endemic to hockey and other male combative sports: avoid all things feminine, engage in homophobic practices. Like, you're encouraged to do this. You're pressured to do this. You're punished if you don't do this, right? So we have to address homophobia in order to stop these atrocities. The hazing too. Rick Westhead from TSN just released a story yesterday, again in Quebec, and it looks like the Quebec Major Junior League's got a ton of problems. Some players are suing. More examples of brutal hazing. What happened with the football team at McGill? There's some serious problems.
Yes, thank you. So we have around 10 minutes left. Oh, we have another question by Lily. Yes, there is time, Lily. I'm not sure if there is time for another question, but in case there is, you just spoke about the importance of increasing education, training, and accountability within the sports community, for example, in leadership and auditing. Do you have any ideas for what kind of interventions can be created for increasing awareness and making it safe to speak out in peer communities?
Well, there is a hotline. I don't know if you know this, that the NHL has now. They have a hotline, and I think all sports should have, some place where people can confidentially talk about what's going on. You can't force people to come forward. It's their choice. But here's something horrific I found out about Hockey Canada. They claim that you can come forward and, talk, you can call someone and talk about your experiences. But Hockey Canada has hired a third party, private sector, which is really disturbing, because this is for profit. And there's all kinds of questions about, confidentiality and so on. So I think there needs to be a designated ombudsperson, an independent ombudsperson, victim advocates, victim survivor advocates, designated, paid for by, sports leagues and organizations. I think this is really, really important because people, she's right, they don't know where to go. They don't know where to turn to. And then, of course, within hockey, there's and in other all-male sports, norms of group secrecy that we find in all-male alliances. You don't rat and so on and so forth.
Right, thank you. And piggyback on that point by Lily, I had a last question. I think we have time for one last.
I've got time, by the way. I've got time.
Yeah, I've got time too. Which is the question of, which is really a focus on, I believe, chapter 2 of the book, which is centering victims and centering survivor stories. But I guess my question is, and that's a general question about activism against sexual violence, which is how do we center survivor voices while protecting them from scrutiny, right? Because so easily they are re-victimized in the public sphere, right? We're going through this huge case with a soccer player here in Brazil. As I was telling you, speaking to what Andrea was saying. So this trial is happening in Spain now, if I'm not mistaken. But the victim chose to remain anonymous, but she ended up being doxxed, possibly by someone close to the accused. So there has been this huge discussion, and as Andrea said, a lot of women, including attacking this victim who now has been doxxed. So I think the question is about how to center while protecting survivors.
Well, I'm the way I was, taught by, pioneers in the field. I came into this field in '88, and I had the luxury and the privilege of being taught by feminist pioneers in the field, like Susan Schechter and Betsy Stanko and other people like that, and Ellen Pence, who created the power and control wheel. And one has to be highly sensitive to the needs of survivors. What do they want first? That's the most important thing. It's not what we think. One of the worst things, I think, is as a researcher or a practitioner is telling them what to do. I think what we can do is give options. Here's what you may want to consider. But what we're seeing now in Spain, I don't know if you've seen this new documentary about those soccer players who, what is the town where the bull run is in Spain?
Right, it's Pamplona, I think. I saw the documentary came out about that case.
Yeah. And this woman came forward, and those boys are now in prison for, I think, at least 15 years. And that's another example of male peer support, for sure. But I think there are examples. What we've got to do as researchers and activists, if we know who is a survivor, be there for her and help provide her with options. That's the first thing you can do. It takes a lot of courage to come forward. The other thing I'm a very strong proponent of is always get an advocate. An advocate, someone who will go with the survivor. Let's say she has the courage to report. The courage, I emphasize that. An advocate should be with her to go to all criminal justice proceedings or everywhere to you know, be there with her. And I think that's one of the most important things. You can't, you know, if she decides to take steps, well, you know, she needs some help. But it's tricky. You know, most survivors don't come forward because of rape myths and because of Jean Ghomeshi and these other things that happened. That was horrific. I mean, that was just, you know, what message did that send out? Or the Johnny Depp case, you know, what did that send out? And so these are kind of things that we're constantly fighting as feminist scholars and activists. We're constantly fighting this, you know, and that's why we got to connect with public sociology and public criminology to challenge that narrative and say, wait a minute, you know. That's why I count myself so lucky to develop this friendship with Stu Cowan and Jack Todd, that they worked with me to publicize the atrocities committed by Logan Mailloux and others.
Yes, thank you. And I did find, I find the collaboration between research and journalism in the book really, really powerful. I had a journalist career before I became a sociologist, so the topic was very dear to me. And what I thought was really interesting was that it was public sociology in the sense that you and Martin were translating knowledge to a wider audience, but there was also an active participation in the media from this investigative perspective, which is what you brought, that I thought was really powerful, because sometimes there are some types of work that journalists are better positioned to do, and then there are other types of work that sociologists are more better positioned to do.
Natalia, you're making a very good point. And, you know, there's an arrogance within, you know, the academy. The amount of work, I have some phenomenal books on corporate crime here on my shelves. And some of the best work was done by investigative journalists who use the case study approach. And I think, you know, these people like Stu, they're at Rinkside, they're there. I mean, they are ethnographers. And, you know, there is this arrogance within the academy to dismiss journalists. Where I'm at, in my thinking, when you see my new book coming out, the amount of incredible time and effort and energy that investigative journalists devoted to these things, and how people like Rick Westhead and Stu and others uncovered this stuff. So I think we really need this. These partnerships are fundamentally important. Journalists are on the front line. They're on the front line. They have access to managers, to all kinds of people in sports world that researchers couldn't possibly have.
Yes, absolutely. I thought that was really powerful, and it made me excited for the public, for the future of public sociology and criminology, for sure.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? I think we're wrapping up. Anyone has some final questions or requests? So do you have any final remarks?
Well, I just want to thank everyone, you know, for participating. It was an honor, and please feel free to contact me if you have any more questions, or if you don't want to develop, you know, keep the dialogue going, because I think we should. I think this is an excellent starting point, particularly in the Canadian context. I think the timing, really quickly, the timing is right. Timing is everything. We've got this movement happening with Hockey Canada, with women's soccer, with other things. So let's keep this momentum going right now. This is really important. Let's not see this issue disappear again.
Yes, I think that ends on a great note. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions or want to contact Walter or the Canadian Sociological Association, here are the contacts. If you want to learn more about the Violence of Society Research Cluster, you can reach out to me or to the office of the CSA, and they will refer you to me. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.